Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video on Genesis Apologetics channel. This one is a half-hour monster of a video which asks the question of whether Adam and Eve are an unscientific myth or are literal history. While I am on the side of them being an unscientific myth, I do think it's important to point out that this question is a false dichotomy. There are plenty of Christians out there who don't believe in a literal Adam or Eve, but consider the story to be metaphorical or allegorical, so they neither believe that it is an unscientific myth or literal history. I am going to be taking this one in multiple parts. I'm not sure yet how many, but y'all know I can often turn 4-minute videos into half-hour monsters of my own. So there's no way I'm getting through this one in one go. So let's go!
It's hard to find anyone who has not heard the often repeated claim that humans and chimpanzees are genetically 98 to 99% identical.
Yes, pretty much everyone has heard that. There are some issues with that number that I'm sure we're going to get into, but before all that, I would just like to point out that a 2005 paper, which is one of the most prominent papers that references the 99% number, pointed out that there are 10 times fewer differences between comparable sections of our genomes and chimp genomes than there are between comparable sections of a rat genome and a mouse genome. Which would mean that we are more closely related to chimps than rats are to mice. And according to the Institute for Creation Research, all rodents are the same created kind. So not only are rats and mice the same kind, but capybaras and mice are the same kind. But somehow humans and chimps are not? Just keep this in mind.
This has been promoted to the world as proof that humans share a common evolutionary ancestor with chimps.
It's not so much that it's proof, but it's something that was definitely expected based on evolution. It does support evolution, and when taken as part of the whole body of evidence for evolution, yes, it is part of what acts as proof, even though there is some wiggle room with the exact number. You see, it's not just the percentage of the genome that's similar, it's also looking closely at which areas are different and tracking the differences. Remember, we didn't evolve from chimps, we share a common ancestor with chimps, so it's not like we're saying that chimp DNA is the original and all the changes have happened on the human side. We can also see places where the chimp genome has changed and the human genome appears to have remained the same.
However, recent studies now challenge this claim.
Ordinarily, when creationists say things like that, I get annoyed because they don't actually have those studies linked anywhere. And while it could have been more straightforward in this case, like just having links to the studies in the description, it was fairly simple to find, as the website that has their watermark all over this video has a references page, which is where they list all the studies that they refer to in the video. There are a couple of things here. First, this is being presented as though scientists originally proposed that we are 99% similar to chimps with no ambiguity or caveats, which is just not true. In fact, a paper published at the same time as the 2005 one that I've already mentioned points out that depending on how liberally we define similarity, we end up having genomes that are very similar to sea squirts. Okay, maybe not very similar, but our genome contains 80% of a sea squirt's genes in one form or another. So that would be kind of like the similarity between the Book of Matthew and the Book of Mark. 94% of the Book of Mark can be found within the Book of Matthew, but his copying of Mark only amounts to about 56% of his actual book. So it's not that they are 94% similar, it's that Matthew contains 94% of Mark, just as we contain 80% of sea squirt genes. Which makes perfect sense evolutionarily speaking. Sea squirts are fairly basal organisms when compared to humans, so the majority of their genes would be coding for stuff that's pretty basic and necessary for most animals, and so those genes would be pretty well conserved, but new genes are still free to be added on to those old ones. Back to humans and chimps, there are 3 sources listed for the fact that we are not 99% similar. One only compares DNA on the Y chromosome, not the whole genome, and as the Y chromosome only makes up about 2% of the genome as a whole, I'm not entirely sure how this is relevant. One is an article that actually points out that the first time researchers came out with the 99% number, it was a problem because a 1% difference in genetics was not thought to be enough to account for the physical and behavioral differences between chimps and humans, meaning that those original researchers from the 70s would likely be quite pleased with this new research. Also, you might have noticed that the original 99% number came from the 70s, which is before we had the ability to examine the genomes on the base pair level, as neither genome had been sequenced at that time. Really, the whole point of figuring out the similarities and differences is not an attempt to claim that we are related. How closely we're related is just a neat little fact that came about as a byproduct of the research, but rather, this is an attempt to figure out which genes do what, which accomplishes things like helping us identify potential genetic disorders and figure out some of the reasons behind other conditions. For instance, chimps don't miscarry anywhere near as often as humans do. An ability to figure out what gene or combination of genes are responsible for that difference could lead us to learn more about why we miscarry so frequently and would potentially allow us to prevent miscarriages in the future. This research would not be possible if we didn't share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, something that all of the sources that you gave for the lower percentage similarity all agree with. Not a single one of those studies came to the conclusion that we are less similar than previously thought, therefore evolution didn't happen. Rather the opposite, they are using the increased knowledge in this matter to come to a greater understanding of evolution.
Earlier studies published in the evolutionary scientific literature reported an overall DNA similarity of 98 to 99%. However, large portions of the chimp genome did not align with the human genome, and so were excluded from the reported estimates.
Yes, 18% of the chimp genome and 25% of the human genome have to be excluded in order to get that 99% number. Which brings up an interesting question. How do we actually determine the similarity anyway? An insertion of one base in one spot on a gene can cause the entire rest of the gene to be out of alignment. Does that mean that this one base causes the unaligned remainder of the gene to not count as being the same, even though the base pair sequences are identical but they are shifted? What if a whole gene is copied into one genome but not the other? Now do we have to consider everything that comes after the duplicated gene to not be similar because it's out of alignment? So to come to the 99% number, they ignored these larger changes that mess with the alignment, and then they compared the rest of our genome on a base pair level, which means that, yes, we ignored a lot of big changes, but the similarity is still quite remarkable and very much indicative of an evolutionary relationship.
For instance, the algorithm parameters used in the major milestone publication in Nature reported by the Chimpanzee Sequencing and Analysis Consortium omitted over 100 million DNA letters.
I mean, yeah, 411 million is over 100 million, but you'd think you would have gone for the over 400 million to sound more impressive. But considering the size of the genome is about 3 billion base pairs, that amounts to about 14% of the genome as a whole, which is even less than was ignored in other research that came to the 99% conclusion. To phrase it another way, over 2.8 billion base pairs were taken into account to arrive at that number.
Initially, we're saying, 98, 99% of the genomes must be similar between chimp and human. The textbooks still say that. But basically, geneticists know that's not correct.
And I would agree that any textbooks that still say that should be updated, at the very least to elaborate on the processes by which that number was arrived at. But the thing about education, especially high school education, is that when you're trying to give a general education, some of the specifics necessarily get lost. Most students will not ever have a use in their lives for the details about how scientists arrived at that 99% number, and most teachers don't have the time to focus on something so apparently insignificant. So it gets trotted out as a, wow, look how closely related we are, and then you move on to more important things, which leaves students who don't pursue that specific area of genetics in higher education with a misconception, which creationists then exploit to cast doubt on essentially all of science by saying, hey, this number that you probably learned about in school is actually wrong, when the reality is more along the lines of, there are more details about how the researchers came to that conclusion that would clarify this matter, but which your teacher likely didn't have time to cover if they were even aware of them in the first place.
If you look at the 2005 chimpanzee genome paper in Nature, you look at subsequent papers, the bonobo paper, the gorilla paper, the orangutan paper, all of them give basically a consistent answer, that most of our DNA can be aligned to chimpanzee and vice versa. And in that region that does align, it's about 1 to 2% different.
Yes. And do you know what makes up the majority of the remaining unaligned regions? Non-coding DNA. Non-coding DNA has, in the past, been called junk DNA because it was thought to not do anything. It's just the accumulation of useless gobbledygook that results from millions of years of evolution. This is not an entirely accurate picture. There is certainly some DNA that is exactly that, but some non-coding regions can have very important regulatory effects, so to call it junk is a misnomer. Non-coding DNA makes up the majority of our genomes, and it is worth mentioning that while the majority of the coding regions of our DNA are shared between humans and chimps, a not insignificant chunk of the non-coding DNA is also shared, even though the majority of the differences are found in the non-coding regions.
So if you incorporate all of these numbers together, the stuff that aligns and is almost identical, the stuff that can't be aligned at all, you get a number about 85%.
I didn't really see that number in any of the studies that we've looked at thus far, but sure, let's go with it. We are 85% identical to chimpanzees. That's still remarkably similar, especially considering that a much higher proportion of our similarities are found in the coding DNA rather than the non-coding DNA.
What's even more important is what that percentage translates to in terms of absolute differences. So an 85% identity, 15% difference in terms of raw DNA letters represents 300 to 400 million single DNA letter differences. That's a massive number.
Yes, it is a massive number, but it's just as important to look at what those differences do. Since the majority of these differences are in non-coding regions, and the majority of the non-coding regions don't even seem to have any function, including regulatory functions, then it stands to reason that the majority of these differences are not functional differences. They are an accumulation of neutral mutations, as would be expected from evolution.
The evolutionary theory claims that humans evolved from a hypothetical chimp-like ancestor roughly 6 million years ago. This is said to have occurred through a long series of beneficial mutations.
No, not beneficial mutations, just mutations. What is considered beneficial is context-dependent. As someone who is starting to reach the age where my lower back is essentially always in at least a little bit of pain, I can say that the mutations that resulted in me being a biped instead of a quadruped are not quite as beneficial as I would like. We humans are stuck in a kind of halfway point, a transitional phase, if you will, where we're obviously not well adapted to bipedal locomotion, which causes us pretty much universal issues with our knees, hips, and back, but we've come too far along the path of bipedality to go back to being quadrupeds. Anyway, my point is that what is considered beneficial depends on the environment that an organism finds itself in. A mutation that gives a mammal a thicker coat of fur would be beneficial if that mammal lives somewhere where it gets cold regularly, but it would be detrimental if that same mammal lived in a tropical jungle.
In light of the actual genomic differences between humans and chimps, this is simply not genetically feasible.
Tell that to all the geneticists who research this topic, including all the ones that wrote all the studies that you guys have referenced thus far. They all make use of evolutionary assumptions, including our common ancestry with chimps, when they do their work. If these evolutionary assumptions are wrong, then their conclusions would also be wrong, meaning that you cannot rely on their conclusions to make your point. But such is the nature of creationism. You gotta cherry pick the stuff that fits your narrative while ignoring the rest. Fun fact, we've already seen Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson in this video. He is a geneticist. Well, according to the Chiron in the part of the video that I skipped, he's a geneticist. He has a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard, and AIG usually calls him a research biologist, while someone like Georgia Purdom, who has a PhD in molecular genetics, is usually advertised as a molecular geneticist. So I think whoever put this together was trying to oversell his credentials in the subject, which is odd given how high his credentials are to begin with. But anyway, back to my point. This guy with legitimate scientific credentials from one of the most prestigious schools in the United States is being interviewed as an authority on this subject, and yet not a single piece of research that they have referenced for this video was published by Dr. Jeanson. You'd think that with such a groundbreaking discovery, you'd be able to get something published along those lines, wouldn't you? But no, they have to rely on referring to papers that use evolution as a base assumption in order to get their results, and then ignore the fact that the results would be completely different if they didn't use evolution as a starting point.
A more accurate chimp-human DNA similarity estimate of 85% represents 300 to 400 million DNA letter differences, an extreme level of genetic discontinuity. This means in order to evolve a chimp-like ancestor into modern humans, hundreds of millions of beneficial mutations need to arise in an ancestral population.
No, that's not how it works. The ancestral population would have been the same for both humans and chimps. Then as time goes on, the two groups of that ancestral population would have split off and started accumulating differences on their own. For those 300 to 400 million differences, you can cut that number roughly in half, as they would be accumulating in the lineage that would eventually lead to humans, as well as the one that would eventually lead to chimps, so it's happening simultaneously. So, to account for 200 million base pair differences per lineage over the course of 7 million years, this would require between 500 to 700 mutations per generation, using a generation time between 20 and 25 years. Given that the average newborn baby has between 50 and 100 mutations, and not all babies are going to share the same mutation, this seems like a very reasonable rate of mutation to me.
The difficulty with accomplishing this has to do with the extremely long waiting time required for establishing even the smallest sets of mutually dependent mutations.
Why are you bringing mutual dependence into this? I was expecting you to go more for how long it takes any given mutation to become fixed in a population. Mutually dependent mutations, just going by the meaning of all those words together, since this doesn't seem to be a term that's used by geneticists, though I am willing to be proven wrong here, just because I couldn't find it doesn't mean it's not a thing, but as far as I can infer, a mutually dependent mutation would be a second mutation that couldn't happen without a prior mutation, or at least wouldn't have the same effect. I think a good example would be the evolution of the ability to metabolize citrate in E. coli, which happened after they bred 30,000 generations. When looking to find out what caused the E. coli to be able to metabolize citrate, they found that the mutation that led them to that ability depended on an earlier mutation that happened around the 20,000th generation. But I'm not sure what relevance this has to the current discussion. Nothing that I am aware of says that all of the mutations that account for the differences between chimps and humans have to have happened in this manner, and even if they did, I see no reason why the prerequisite mutations couldn't have been present in our common ancestor. Given the different selection pressures our ancestors would have received when compared to the chimp's ancestors, there's no reason to expect that every prerequisite mutation would have the exact same result in both lineages.
Even granting a best-case scenario for evolution by generously assuming human and chimp DNA is 99% identical, the remaining 1% would still be a difference of 30 million DNA letters.
Which is but a tiny drop in the bucket of our genomes.
An impossible genetic barrier for evolution to traverse in 6 million years.
6 to 8 million years. I split the difference and used 7 for my calculations.
That's a lot of new information. And when we talked about the waiting time, we were saying, well, 8 mutations, waiting for 8 specific mutations takes more time than the time since the Big Bang.
There are a number of issues with this waiting time paper, starting with the fact that at least 2 of the authors are well-known advocates for young Earth creationism. The second of the two, John Baumgartner, doesn't even work in any fields relevant to developmental biology. He's a geophysicist. So what he's doing as a co-author on a paper about how long it takes a mutation to fix in a population is just beyond my ability to guess. To give a brief summary of the paper, what they did was run an evolution simulation in which a population of 10,000 organisms started with a randomly generated genetic code, and then through the simulation they would mutate and breed with other members of the population with the goal of reaching a genetic code that contained a predefined target. Once the target was reached in one organism, that segment of the genome would be locked in, and then it would see how long it would take for the target gene to spread through the entire population. They found that to get an 8 nucleotide string, it would take an average of 18.5 billion years. The first and most obvious problem here to me is that evolution doesn't work towards a target. Sure, the human and chimp genomes are what we ended up with, but how many other potential organisms could exist with other variations on our genomes that could have happened in those 6 to 8 million years had the selection pressures been different? We don't know, but we didn't have to hit the ones that we did. So I wonder how long it would take if that scenario was rerun, but with thousands of potentially acceptable targets instead of just one. Second, it began each organism with a genome that was either randomly generated or given through user input, which isn't exactly analogous to our common ancestor with chimps. It didn't have a randomly generated genome. It had a genome that was crafted through millions of years of selective pressures to be what it was, which potentially gave it a leg up on the mutating towards what would eventually become chimps and humans. Third, they seem to have kept the population stable at 10,000 individuals. This is not what happens in reality. Populations fluctuate, and the fluctuations can affect how quickly mutations can accumulate within a population. Well, they did rerun it with different population sizes, but they always seem to have assumed a stable population size in their simulation. Fourth, it doesn't seem to allow for the fact that evolution operates in a rather parallel manner. We didn't evolve one trait at a time and not begin evolving the next trait until that one is fixed in the population. Multiple traits are evolving all the time. Fifth, and probably the most damning in my opinion, is that even if we ignore all of the other problems and just run with their conclusions here, then that means that artificial selection that farmers rely on would be completely impossible. So even the microevolution that creationists are so fond of agreeing with would not be possible if the conclusion of this study were true. Since a part of evolution that both creationists and evolutionists can agree on would be rendered impossible by the results of this study, what then are we to conclude? That reality itself is broken? Or that this study has some pretty major flaws that impact its conclusions?
So waiting time for beneficials is different from waiting time for neutrals. You don't have to wait long for a neutral.
Exactly! Neutral mutations happen all the time, in every single individual ever, which makes it easier for the neutral mutations to become fixed in a population, which improves the chances that, at some point in the future, a mutation will occur that provides a function for one of these neutral mutations. And of course, this is just looking purely at mutation. There are other mechanisms that evolution works through, such as recombination and sexual selection, which work together to exaggerate features that are already present without necessarily requiring mutations to enhance that feature. And of course, the dude is only talking about point mutations as if those are the be-all and end-all. They are not. There are insertions, deletions, and duplications as well, some of which can result in a frame shift, which can have a dramatic impact on how the genes are expressed. And they don't necessarily have to be restricted to single points. We need look no further than the common strawberries for examples of organisms that have had their entire genome duplicated, in strawberries' case 8 times. What's more, when studying strawberry genomes, researchers have found that some traits are influenced more by one copy of the genome than by others, which supports the idea that duplication events can lead to the development and specialization of new traits. With so many copies of the genome, there's more freedom for mutations to occur that won't remove necessary functionality, as that functionality can still be coded for using the original version of the genome. In fact, a 2006 study actually found that more than 97% of R protein coding genomes show evidence of having been the result of a duplication event, with 80% of those showing an evolutionary relationship to one or more other proteins in different regions. So not only do duplications happen, but they are arguably more important than the single point mutations.
Or for deleterious, you have to wait a really, really long time if you're waiting for a specific and beneficial one.
Yeah, if you have a specific one in mind, you will have to wait a really, really long time for that specific mutation to occur. Thankfully, evolution doesn't work toward a specific goal, it works on a general level. Organisms that generally do better are the ones that survive, so any change that helps an organism do generally better, no matter what that change is, will be selected for. So we don't have to wait for one specific change when there are, conservatively, millions of potential changes that will do the trick.
Population geneticist Michael Lynch confesses in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution. A central problem in the evolutionary theory concerns the mechanisms by which adaptations requiring multiple mutations emerge in natural populations.
Yes, that is the first sentence of the abstract. Do you know what the beginning of the abstract for a scientific paper is supposed to do? Describe the problem that they are seeking to solve. It's an explanation as to why they think their research is necessary. Now, let's read a little bit further into the abstract. Under a broad range of conditions, the time to establishment also scales by no more than the square of the mutation rate, regardless of the number of sites contributing to the adaptive change, demonstrating that the emergence of complex adaptations is only weakly constrained by the independent acquisition of mutations at the underlying sites. Huh. That doesn't sound like mutations take way too long to make evolution happen as fast as it does. That sounds more like complex adaptations can happen without being unduly constrained by the underlying mutations.
Lynch's calculations suggest the length of time required for just 2 specific mutations to become established in a pre-human population is over 200 million years.
I'm not sure where you're pulling that number from. Now, this paper is a good deal more technical than I'm used to dealing with, so I'm not going to claim that I have a perfect understanding of the whole thing, but the paper doesn't even touch on our common ancestor with chimps, nor does it give times for mutation fixation in years, using generations instead. He says that alleles that are quite complex can readily emerge in populations on timescales of between 1,000 and 100 million generations, which for microbes could be from a few weeks to several months, and for humans, assuming a generation time of 25 years, would be a range between 25,000 and 2.5 billion years. 200 million years is certainly within that range, but given all the other data that we have about our common ancestor with chimps living some 6 to 8 million years ago, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of the changes that we've seen between us and that common ancestor happened closer to the 25,000 end of the range than the 2.5 billion end of the range. And on top of all that, he goes on to point out at the end of the paper that their results are very conservative, because in order to simplify their calculations, they had to ignore a number of factors that are known to happen in nature, which would have sped up the process. If someone were getting their information just from you guys, they could be forgiven for thinking that Lynch came to a conclusion that is exactly the opposite of the conclusion that he actually reached in this paper. But of course, we all know that cherry-picking and quote mining are the creationists' bread and butter.
Evolutionary geneticists Durrett and Schmidt of Cornell University report in the Annals of Applied Probability that the average waiting time to form a slightly longer DNA sequence of 8 specific mutations is on the order of 650 million years.
Yes, they did report that. Again, this is from the abstract. It does point out that for an 8-letter match, the mean waiting time would be 650 million years. But then, let's read the very next sentence in the abstract, right after it points that out. Fortunately, in biological reality, the match to the target word does not have to be perfect for binding to occur. If we model this by saying a 7 out of 8 letter match is good enough, the mean reduces to about 60,000 years. 60,000 years sounds quite reasonable when looking at changes that happen over the course of 6 to 8 million years.
But this estimate is incomplete.
You're right, it was incomplete. When it was completed with information from how biology actually works, it gets 4 orders of magnitude shorter than you presented.
When accounting for random loss to a well-established principle known as genetic drift, the actual waiting time should be 100-fold longer, roughly 65 billion years.
Hold up a sec. Genetic drift is one of the mechanisms of evolution. Why would including multiple mechanisms of how evolution works somehow make it take longer? You'd think having multiple mechanisms at work simultaneously would cause it to work faster. Genetic drift is the part where random chance comes into play, where some members of the population might be more successful than others, not because of any particular feature, but just through circumstantial luck. Genetic drift usually happens in smaller populations and can have a pretty big impact on the evolutionary development of small populations after a bottleneck event. One outcome of genetic drift is the rapid fixation of genes that were not previously fixed. I mean, the opposite's also true. It could eliminate genes that were previously close to fixation, but given that genetic drift is known to often speed things up, I fail to see why genetic drift would cause things to slow down so drastically.
At best, all evolution can hope to accomplish in the prescribed 6 million year time span is the formation of a tiny DNA sequence, no more than a few genetic letters in length, totally incapable of producing a single new gene.
Perhaps, if all of your assertions thus far were correct and if evolution only worked on one sequence at a time, but unfortunately for you, you're wrong on both counts.
If humans did not evolve from ape-like creatures, then where did we come from?
Well, since all the evidence points to us having evolved from ape-like creatures into the apes that we are today, then I'd say that that's a pointless question. I mean, certainly we can go back to the origin of life and ask where life itself came from, and that is a fascinating question with a lot of really interesting science being done, but somehow I don't think that's where you're going with this.
The Genesis account of creation states that God made Adam and Eve, not as mythical beings, but as the literal historical ancestors of all living people.
And there it is. The argument thus far essentially boils down to, we think that there are some problems with this one specific mechanism of evolution, if we only read a cherry-picked assortment of quotes out of abstracts from papers that actually demonstrate how wrong we are, Therefore, not just any god made us, but specifically the interpretation of the biblical God favored by young Earth creationists. Like, sure, the Bible does tell that story, but if you take that story literally, it is scientifically impossible. Hell, if you take it literally, it's not even internally consistent. Not to mention the fact that you just miss out on a lot of the cultural significance and depth if you insist on taking it literally. And that's not even bringing up the fact that creationists are very selective about which aspects they take literally. Is the serpent anything more than just a talking serpent? Well, if we take the story literally, no, it's just a talking serpent. But somehow, creationists managed to impose the personality of a fallen angel onto the serpent, with there being no such indication in the text. Would Adam die the day he ate the fruit? Literally, it says that he definitely would. But he didn't. He lived more than 9 centuries after he ate the fruit. If the story is to be believed, then Adam was actually one of the most long-lived humans to have ever lived, despite having eaten a fruit that God said would kill him on day 1. Oh, but that wasn't a literal death, that was a spiritual death. And then also Adam and Eve successfully hid from God. That's literally what the story says. But no, God was just pretending to not be able to find them in order to test them or something. Does it say that in the text? No, that is a non-literal interpretation. So no matter how you slice it, the stories in Genesis 1 through 3 cannot possibly be literally true.
They were the first 2 human beings created, with all humans descending from this first couple.
Which makes it quite impressive that after their first 2 kids were grown up enough to have one murdering the other, there were already cities established that Cain was afraid to go to because everywhere on the earth people would want to kill him, so he needed special protection from God to make sure that all these people that somehow existed would know not to kill him.
From a purely genetic standpoint, is it scientifically feasible that all humans descended from a single mother and a single father?
No, it's not. At least not if you mean that this mother and father were themselves a couple. I think the video's about to get into Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, and that's a whole new can of worms, so we'll save that for part 2. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Anne-Marie Dedekind, sorry if I mispronounced that, who says, I do not agree on Jephthah's story, since God let people choose. People make mistakes, and God is not here to make us prevent our mistakes, because that is taking away our ability to choose, and we need to learn also from our mistakes. Okay, there's a lot wrong here, but specific to the story of Jephthah's daughter, that's the one where Jephthah promises that he'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house when he gets home if God helps him win his war. He then wins his war, comes home, and his daughter is the first thing out, so naturally he sacrifices her to God. Now, people often use parenting as an analogy for God, so let's roll with that. I do sometimes let my kids make their own mistakes so they can learn from them. But do you know when I would step in to intervene? Say if one of them were to promise me that they'd kill the cat for me in exchange for something that they want. My explaining to them that I don't want the cat to die in no way messes with their free will or their ability to learn from less permanent mistakes. As I explained in the video that this comment was on, God had many options when Jephthah made that offer. He could have stepped in and said, no, that's okay, it'll be a human coming out, and I'm not into the whole human sacrifice thing. He could have made a counter-offer, asking for an animal sacrifice instead. He could have not given Jephthah what he was asking for in exchange for the sacrifice, thereby not making the sacrifice necessary. God could have intervened to ensure that an animal was the first thing out of the house instead of the daughter. None of these options interferes with Jephthah's free will or his ability to make a mistake. In fact, the option where God allows Jephthah to lose the war instead of win places the consequences for his mistake on Jephthah rather than on his daughter, who knows nothing of this scenario and is the ultimate victim of the story. The problem is that God gives Jephthah what he asked for in exchange for the sacrifice, which sends the message that God will give you good things in exchange for human sacrifices. So, if anything, this course of action on God's part encourages more of the same mistake to be made, rather than causing anyone to learn from their mistake. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Bryn Pound, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the billions of years it would take for my channel to evolve naturally. If you'd like to be an incarnation of time, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!